My wife asked if she could dance with another man at the special company party, and my answer was brief, almost indifferent. A cold, automatic, if you want, said like someone trying to pretend they feel nothing when, inside, their heart has already begun to bleed. She smiled, hesitated for 2 seconds, and went. The music was loud, the room was full of people, but what occupied my field of vision was the image of the two of them approaching, laughing, dancing in a way that was never just dancing. She twirled, smiled, and his gaze pierced her as if he'd known her for years. I tried to keep my glass steady, tried to chat with colleagues, tried to pretend it was just dancing. But a part of me knew that there, on that brightly lit dance floor, there was something I could no longer fix. Something was slipping away from me, and it was her. That same night, driving home, in the silence of the car, with the city lights reflecting off the glass, she tried to strike up a conversation. She talked about the party, the laughter, the good music. I just listened. At some point, she asked, "Were you upset about that dance?" And I replied in a low voice, almost a whisper, "If what we have isn't enough for you, then it's over." She tried to laugh, thinking it was an exaggeration, but when she looked into my eyes, she understood. There was something there that wasn't whole anymore. I got out of the car with a heavy heart, went into the house, and started packing my backpack. She followed, grabbed my arm, and asked me to stop, saying it was nothing, that it was just a silly flirtation, that she didn't know I was feeling that way. She said she loved me. She said she didn't want to lose me. But there was a problem. In life, sometimes what destroys is not the act itself, but the moment in which it happens. It's not the complete betrayal, it's the small choice that, little by little, erodes the structure. And that night, she chose something different. She chose a lightness that didn't include the weight of my presence. And it hurt. It hurt in a way that made me lose sleep, lose my appetite, lose my bearings. For days, I tried to forget, tried to think I was exaggerating, that it was my jealousy. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw them both laughing. It was worse than a hidden kiss. It was worse because it happened in front of me, with my implicit consent, with my silence as witness. Time passed. Not much, but enough for her to understand that the man wanted nothing more than that night. When she tried to get closer to him, he said bluntly, "It was just fun." I didn't even remember anymore. And that's when the ground began to crumble. Because, even though she still had me close, she no longer had me completely. I started going out more often, talking to old friends again, taking short trips, reading again, looking in the mirror and wondering what I was doing with someone who made me feel less than. She texted me, cooked dinner, smiled like someone trying to light an unlit candle with their bare hands. But I couldn't feel the same way anymore. When she touched mine, I remembered her eyes shining for another man. When she told me she loved me, all I could think was, but did she love me enough to choose to dance with someone else? Love, for me, has always been a choice, not an impulse. And that day, she chose a different path. I was trying to move on, little by little, when she tried to win me back for good. She asked me to talk, looked me in the eye, and told me she regretted it, that she would do everything differently. That she now understood the value of loyalty, that she knew there wasn't a kiss, but there was disrespect. That she never imagined she could lose me so quickly. But fate has a poetic sense of justice. One day, I went for a run in the park and saw a woman sitting alone, reading the same book I'd read years ago, when I still believed love was rare and indestructible. She had a serene look in her eyes, a peace that contrasted with the storm I was carrying. We talked. Once, twice, 3 times. And without realizing it, I started smiling again. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because I'd found a place where I could be whole again. A place where respect was natural, where the truth didn't need to be demanded. And it was with this new woman by my side that my ex came looking for me. She appeared unexpectedly, her eyes brimming with tears, telling me she still loved me, that she wanted another chance. She said she was willing to wait, that she would do whatever it took. But I looked at her tenderly, even gratefully, and said, I forgive you. But today I love someone else. And in that moment, I saw her face break into silence. I saw regret fall from her eyes in the form of tears. And for the first time, she understood what I felt on that dance floor. She understood what it's like to watch someone you love choose another direction, while you stand there, stranded. The cruelest thing in life is that some things never come back. Love, when broken, can be mended, but it will never be the same. And she understood this too late. I moved on. Not with anger, but with the serenity of someone who has learned that true love cannot be divided. That those who love you don't expose you. That the worst betrayal isn't physical, it's emotional. And that sometimes, what hurts isn't losing the other person, but realizing they lost you without even realizing it. Months later, she passed me on the street. She was alone, with a distant look in her eyes. We exchanged a shy, polite, almost automatic wave. And in that instant, I felt pity. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because here was someone who had destroyed their own future in a moment of distraction. She looked at me with eyes full of memories. I looked at her with eyes full of peace. Years later, chance, or perhaps fate, brought us face to face in the place where it all began. The park bench where we met. I was with the new woman in my life, laughing at a silly comment, and when I looked to the side, she was there, watching silently, her eyes fixed on the past. In that moment, she knew she had lost not just a man, but a kind of love that might never return. But what she never knew, is what I kept inside my backpack, that very night I decided to leave. And that's where the Betrayal story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support betrayal in any form. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a cruel truth: betrayal destroys lives, corrodes homes and scars hearts forever. Our goal is to show, through fiction, the real price of wrong choices. Get ready for a story deeply moving, intense and unforgettable. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next will leave you speechless. They met on a sultry Friday afternoon, like someone who stumbles upon something that changes the entire course of their lives. He, Daniel, had just finished work and, tired of the exhausting routine, decided to go into a sparsely populated coffee shop. She, Laura, was sitting alone, reading a book he knew well, a small, almost imperceptible detail, but it caught his attention like a spark igniting inside his chest. He wasn't the impulsive type, but something about that scene made him stop. Maybe it was the calm way she turned the pages, or the way her eyes seemed oblivious to the noise of the world around them. He approached her with a silly excuse, mentioned the book, and, to his surprise, she smiled in a way that dissolved all the defenses he hadn't even known he had. That's how it began. No plans, no promises, just a conversation that ended with a "shall we do this again sometime," and a number saved in his phone. That first meeting marked the beginning of a relationship that grew slowly but profoundly. Daniel was an architect, meticulous, detail-oriented, and saw beauty in the simplest things: a well-lit space, a textured wall, a chair with well-defined curves. Laura worked in cultural marketing, creative, sensitive, someone who read poetry during her breaks and believed that art could save the world. They complemented each other in a strange way, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that, by some miracle, fit together. They weren't the most romantic couple in the world, nor the most perfect, but there was something about them that worked. A quiet balance between chaos and structure. In the early years, they built a home together filled with details: photographs on the walls, plants in every corner, books stacked on the floor, the aromas of coffee mingling with the sounds of old records. Every object seemed chosen with intention, as if they both understood that their shared space was an extension of the love they cultivated. Laura had a habit of leaving hidden notes, in Daniel's shirt pocket, on the refrigerator door, inside the car, and he would respond with messages drawn on napkins or spontaneous invitations to impromptu dinners. They laughed easily, fought quietly, and made up with lingering hugs. There was a routine, yes, but a routine that felt light, built on mutual trust and the pleasure of sharing life. For a long time, the two seemed to be heading in the same direction. They had similar goals: stability, occasional trips, loyal friends, lazy Sunday afternoons. Daniel was more reserved in his words, but it showed in his actions. He made coffee before she woke up, stopped by the grocery store without her asking, remembered the details of their conversations. Laura was more emotional, talking about her feelings, writing letters on random dates, crying at old movies, and always reaching out when he least expected it. They both came from very different families, he from a quiet home, she from a noisy one, but they learned to create a third way between their two worlds. This united them. It made them feel that, despite their differences, they had built something solid, something real. But reality is never static. As the years passed, small cracks began to appear. Nothing alarming. Just fatigue. Daniel began working harder, taking on bigger projects, returning late, worried about deadlines and clients. Laura, meanwhile, immersed herself in new challenges at work, dealing with more intense campaigns and people who demanded her constant attention. Saturday lunches became rushed dinners, and weekends once reserved for the two of them were taken over by events, commitments, and tasks. The house remained intact, the walls still held laughter, but there were silences that had previously been absent. Glances that strayed. Hugs that were shorter. Even so, they both seemed certain that love still existed. And indeed it did. It wasn't an absence of love. It was weariness, it was routine, it was fatigue. Daniel continued to look at Laura with admiration, still getting lost in the sound of her laughter from time to time. Laura still felt a warmth in her chest when she saw his name flashing on her phone. But there was a growing distance, as if each of them were walking through parallel corridors, separated by a wall too thin to be noticeable but thick enough to prevent touching. The culmination of this distancing came with an important event, Laura's special company party. She spent days choosing her dress, practicing her makeup, deciding whether to wear her new heels or more comfortable ones. She wanted to look beautiful and confident, not only for her colleagues but also for herself. Daniel noticed her effort and offered discreet but sincere praise. He was proud of her and what she had accomplished, and despite the accumulated fatigue of the week, he made an effort to keep up with her, keep smiling, and participate. At the party, she stood out. Not just for her appearance, but for her presence. Everyone seemed to want to talk to her, laugh with her, dance with her. Daniel watched from afar, sitting in a corner, his glass in his hand and his gaze quiet. He wasn't jealous, he felt nostalgia. He missed the time when that smile was exclusively his. He said nothing, just watched. She came up to him a few times, asked if he was okay, lightly touched his hand. He said yes. Then Laura returned to the dance floor, returned to her colleagues, returned to the room where she seemed more alive than he had seen her in a long time. There was something about the way she moved that night that bothered Daniel. A different glow, an energy he no longer saw when they were alone. He tried to ignore it, rationalize it. He remembered their conversations, their plans, their years together. He thought maybe it was just the euphoria of the moment, of recognition, of the new environment. But deep down, a small voice was already warning him that something was changing. Not out of malice, not out of coldness, but one of those subtle shifts life makes, where what was once certain becomes questionable, where comfort gives way to doubt. Laura, on the other hand, felt conflicted. She wanted Daniel to be more present, more involved, more, by her side. She was tired of always being the one to start the conversation, the one to suggest plans, the one to keep things going. She loved him, but she missed being desired, missed feeling chosen, not just accompanied. That night, she wanted to shine, and she wanted him to see her shine. Not out of vanity, but because she needed to rediscover herself. And on some level, she wanted him to find her again, too. The party ended, and the two returned home in silence. There were no arguments, no confrontations. Just a silence filled with thoughts they dared not speak. Each, deep down, tried to understand what was happening. They both remembered the beginning, the notes, the coffees, the endless conversations, the rainy nights under the same blanket. They both wanted to believe it was still possible to recapture that. But the truth is, as much love as there was, something was no longer the same. In the following days, Laura tried to be more approachable. She made coffee, struck up a conversation, asked about his projects. Daniel reciprocated with small gestures, but inside, something was beginning to crumble, still unnamed, still unformed. They were both in that dangerous stage where love exists, but it's not enough. Where feelings are still there, but overshadowed by unhealed wounds, by swallowed words, by gestures left unsaid. A stage where any misstep can cause a rupture. And it was in this scenario, in a relationship where the love still existed but was already struggling with wear and tear, that something happened. Something that, at that moment, no one saw coming. Not Laura, not Daniel. Something that would change the course of history, not like an immediate earthquake, but like a crack that slowly grows, until it shatters everything in half. And when that happened, neither of them would be the same. The time after the party was filled with disguised silences and small attempts to return to normal, but what had once seemed natural now seemed rehearsed. Daniel would wake up earlier, leave before Laura opened her eyes, and return late, often with her already asleep on the couch. The affectionate gestures were still there, but restrained, almost automatic. He still hugged her as he passed her in the kitchen, she still made him coffee just the way he liked it, but their eyes almost never met. It was as if a thin, transparent veil had fallen between them. It didn't prevent touch, but it did prevent warmth. And this, day after day, suffocated what remained of lightness. Laura tried to recapture the lost intimacy. She insisted on talking, suggested plans, asked about his work with an enthusiasm that was no longer natural, but rather the result of a desperate effort not to let him slip through her fingers. And Daniel, even though he realized it, felt increasingly absent. Not out of ill will, but because something inside him was being eroded. The image of her on that dance floor, laughing, dancing, surrendering herself to a moment he wasn't a part of, still pulsed in his mind. There was no concrete betrayal there, he knew. There was no kiss, no explicit touch, but the pain he felt was real. It was the pain of someone who felt displaced from their place. And this pain, silent, began to create an abyss. Little by little, he began to grow quiet. He no longer talked about his feelings, avoided deeper conversations, and casually avoided her gaze. Laura, on the other hand, began to feel a constant weight on her chest. She tried to pretend she didn't understand, but the change was there. He no longer looked at her the same way. And she knew part of it was a consequence of her own choices. She hadn't done anything, she told herself. Just danced, just had fun. But at the same time, she knew that night, she had sought a kind of validation she hadn't found at home. And that shamed her. Miguel's name began to come up frequently in her casual conversations. A new colleague from the communications department, intelligent, friendly, with an easy sense of humor and a look of constant interest. She said he was just funny, that it was nice to work with someone who took things lightly. But deep down, she felt like she was crossing an invisible line, even though she justified her feelings with moral arguments. She didn't want to admit, not even to herself, that lightheartedness, that curious look, and that constant attention were stirring something she thought she'd buried. She started smiling more when she received texts out of hours, taking a little longer to respond to her husband on work calls, instinctively hiding her phone screen. And all of this was eating away at her. She knew she was moving away from the fine line between right and wrong, but she also felt that Daniel no longer saw her as he once did. The distance between them was becoming apparent even to their closest friends. During dinner with a couple, one of them innocently commented that they'd been quieter, and Laura just smiled awkwardly, while Daniel pretended not to hear. After that dinner, she tried to get closer again. She laid her head on his shoulder in the living room, told him she missed them both, and asked if they were still okay. Daniel simply replied that everything was fine, with a neutral tone that made her freeze inside. She persisted, asking if he still felt the same way. And he, after a few seconds of silence, said he was tired, that he just wanted to sleep. There was no anger, no fighting, indeed, there was a gentle, dangerous, silent distance, like a tide receding slowly but definitively. Then, one random afternoon, Miguel invited her to lunch. He said there was a new restaurant near work and that it would be good to break from the routine. She hesitated. Considered refusing. But she accepted. During lunch, they laughed, chatted, talked about everything, except Daniel. When he complimented her for the third time, saying she had a different sparkle in her eyes, she looked away, uncomfortable. She felt flattered, but also dirty. As if she were allowing someone to occupy a space that shouldn't be vacant. Still, when he lightly touched her hand across the table, she didn't flinch. She didn't move forward, but she didn't pull away either. In the following days, their contact increased. Funny messages, shared videos, inside jokes. She smiled to herself, found herself waiting for the next message. She even deleted some conversations, not because there was anything compromising, but because she didn't want Daniel to see them. And this act, so small, so seemingly insignificant, was the trigger for the beginning of the end. Because, when she deleted it, she realized something was wrong. Something she could no longer control. And yet, she didn't stop. One night, after a long meeting that ended late, Laura said she was going to dinner with her colleagues. Daniel just nodded. He no longer asked any questions. He no longer showed any discomfort. And that, for her, was the hardest blow. His indifference hurt more than any argument. During that dinner, Miguel was there. Amidst laughter, glasses of wine, and relaxed conversation, their gazes met more intensely. And in the parking lot, when he offered to walk her to her car, there was a kiss. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. It just happened. Quick, messy, guilt-ridden. She immediately backed away, saying she couldn't, that it was wrong, that it could never happen again. Miguel nodded respectfully, but there was a smile hidden at the corner of his mouth. And that disturbed her more than the kiss itself. That night, when she got home, Daniel was already asleep. Or pretending to be. She slipped into the bathroom, stared at her reflection in the mirror, and wondered who that woman was. She cried softly, silently, her hands covering her mouth, as if to contain the pain, the guilt, the shame. She still loved Daniel, she had no doubt. But she had done something that could never be undone. And now, with every small gesture of his, every silence, every dull look, she felt diminished. The weight of the betrayal was crueler than she had imagined. It wasn't just the act. It was what he said about her. It was what she had come to see in herself. In the following days, Laura tried to compensate. She was more affectionate, more present, more attentive. Daniel, for his part, remained silent, distant, but observant. He noticed the change, but said nothing. He just watched. And, at some point, he became suspicious. Not because she had changed in any obvious way, but because something in her eyes had disappeared. That transparency, that confidence, that sparkle. They were different. And he, who had always trusted without question, began to piece together small clues, small silences, disguised absences. He didn't ask anything. Not yet. But he was already beginning to piece together a silent puzzle, inside his own chest. The final break didn't come with screams or confessions. It came with a simple sentence. One Sunday night, while she was preparing dinner and he was setting the table, she asked, matter-of-factly, if he'd mind if she danced with a colleague at their next get-together. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her for a few long seconds, as if finally seeing what he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. And then, in a low voice, he said, if you want. Nothing more. Nothing less. And in that instant, she understood that he knew. That he'd always known. Daniel said nothing that night, nor the next. But silently, he began to drift away. And when he finally decided to leave, he left behind not only a home, but a history that now bore the weight of its shattering. And even without yet revealing what he held in his heart, he knew there was more to come. A secret she never imagined. And one that would change everything. The day she showed up at his house with teary eyes was also the day he decided to stop running from what he felt. He was calm, dressed simply, the house silent, lit only by the soft light that filtered through the curtains. She entered without waiting for an invitation, as if she no longer knew where she was stepping, as if crossing a minefield in search of something that, deep down, she knows is no longer there. Her voice was shaky, unsteady, as if each word struggled with shame and regret. She said she had made a mistake, that she didn't know how to explain it, that she had lost herself and that now she understood everything. He said Daniel had been the best thing life had ever given her and that, in return, she had hurt him. She begged for forgiveness, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on his as if begging to be seen again as before, as if wanting to return to a time when his gaze still held love and not disappointment. Daniel listened to her in silence. Each word was like a distant echo, because, in that moment, he no longer lived in the same time as her. He saw her there, before him, trying to rescue something dead, and for a brief second, he felt pity. Not for the woman who betrayed him with a hidden kiss and secretly exchanged messages. But pity for the woman who, only now, realized what she had destroyed. And, no matter how much she said it was just a mistake, a moment, meaning nothing, he knew the meaning lay precisely in her choice to set aside everything they had built for something so shallow. He let her speak, and when she finally fell silent, when her tears turned into a resigned sigh, he calmly approached and said, with a softness that didn't match what she expected, "I forgive you." She blinked, confused, surprised. She hadn't expected that. He repeated, looking into her eyes, without hatred, without irony, "I forgive you, Laura. But I don't want you anymore." It was in that instant that she knew. Her heart understood before her mind. His gaze no longer sought her with desire, nor with pain. There was another glow there, a glow that was no longer hers. She tried to ask, wanted to know if there was another, if he had already moved on, and he just smiled, melancholy, and said that life has paths we only see when pushed by pain. She insisted, wanted to know, wanted to hear. She needed to understand who she was divided with now. Daniel hesitated for a moment, not because he wanted to hide, but because he knew that what came next wasn't just about a new love, it was about what she had lost. He said that, weeks after leaving home, he decided to return to the park where they had met. He didn't know why. Maybe out of nostalgia, maybe in an attempt to start over. He sat on the bench where, years before, he had struck up a conversation with her over a book. He was there, thinking how time is simultaneously cruel and beautiful, when he saw a woman sitting with the same title in her hands. The same book. The coincidence made him smile. She looked, he commented, they laughed. They talked for almost an hour, as if they were old acquaintances. There was no immediate enchantment, no promises. Just a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. And that was enough. In the following days, they met again, first by chance, then by choice. She was different from Laura in every way. She had a calm gaze, a gentle way of listening, a patience that demanded nothing. He didn't seek her out for refuge, nor for revenge. It just happened. Little by little, he told her about what he'd experienced, without going into details, and she simply listened, without judging, without interrupting. It was as if the silence that had hurt so much in their marriage was now filled with a kind of silent understanding. And little by little, he began to open up, allowing himself to, until he realized he was truly smiling, laughing out loud, sleeping peacefully. Laura stared at him, her face pale, trying to take it all in. She asked who he was, where they met, what he was like. And with each answer, her eyes sank a little deeper. When he said they were together, that it was serious, that he felt respected, understood, she stood up abruptly, as if the floor had given way. She paced the room aimlessly, covered her face with her hands, and sat down again. She tried to tell him he couldn't do this, that she still loved him, that they had a history. And that's when Daniel stood up, walked to the bookshelf, and picked something up. It was a small envelope, folded and already a little crumpled. He handed it to her. Laura opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter. One she never knew existed. Written the day he left home. Daniel had written it and never sent it. On the paper, words were sincere, painful, intense. He said he forgave her even without knowing all the details, because he didn't want to carry hate in his heart. He said he didn't understand how they got there, but he knew it was impossible to go on. And, in the end, he said the only thing that hurt the most was knowing that, despite everything, he would still have chosen her if she had looked at him before looking at someone else. Her hands were shaking. The tears were now streaming uncontrollably. She looked at him, as if trying to turn back time, as if begging for a second chance that would never come. She said he was also to blame, that he had also walked away, that it wasn't just her. But her voice was no longer strong. She knew. She knew nothing justified what she had done. And now she also knew that he had found in another woman what she had failed to preserve. The final blow came when, at the end of that conversation, he walked to the door and opened it. She hesitated, unwilling to leave, still believing she could insist. But when she saw, next to the door, a framed photograph, him and his new wife, smiling, sitting on the park bench where his story with Laura had begun, she understood. She understood that he had not only moved on, but that he had remade his own beginning, as if to say, without saying it, that the page had been completely turned. Laura left. Her heart crushed, her eyes burning, her legs weak. Not because she no longer had Daniel, but because she knew he now belonged to a story where she was just an uncomfortable memory. She walked aimlessly through the streets, reliving every moment, every choice, every gesture. And, as she passed a bookstore window, she saw the same book from years ago. The same one she'd been reading when it all began. She stopped. She placed her hand on the glass. And there, she understood once and for all. Life exacts its toll. And sometimes, it exacts a high interest rate. But what she still didn't know was what Daniel had really left behind the day he left. Because, besides the letter, there was something else. Something he'd kept hidden. Something that, when revealed, would forever change what she thought she knew about that love. Laura couldn't sleep that night. The memory of the photo by the door, of the new woman beside Daniel, of the smile that was once hers now plastered on another face, corroded every inch of her soul. She had returned home like a ghost, walking through the rooms as if they were ruins of a life she herself had demolished. The silence seemed to mock her, and every detail of the environment reminded her of his absence, the cup he always left on the counter, the book on the shelf he never finished, the pillow that now no longer bore his scent. Everything seemed to have been swallowed by an irreversible vacuum. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to organize her thoughts, but everything seemed blurry. She wanted to go back, fix, undo, but time, relentless, offered no shortcuts. In the morning, she decided she needed to see him again. Not to win him back, but to understand. There was something still unsaid, something in his eyes that carried a veiled message, something that went beyond the new relationship, beyond the letter, beyond the photograph. She crossed the city with her heart in her throat. She didn't call ahead, didn't announce her arrival, she just went. When she reached his door, she took a deep breath and knocked. She waited. And when the door opened, it wasn't Daniel on the other side, it was her, the woman in the photograph, his new girlfriend. The shock was immediate. Laura froze, unsure of what to say. The woman, with her sweet features and serene demeanor, recognized her. The embarrassment was palpable. Before another word could be spoken, Daniel appeared in the background, wearing a simple shirt, his hair still wet, as if he'd just stepped out of the shower. Seeing Laura, he took a deep breath and approached, asking her new companion for a moment. She nodded gently before leaving, gently closing the door behind her. Now they were there, face to face again, but in a completely different atmosphere. There was no more resentment, no anger, no urgency. Just a tense silence, filled with everything that still hung between them. Laura was direct. She said she needed answers, that she sensed he was holding something back, that even after everything, she deserved to know the full truth. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds, then asked her to accompany him to the park. He said there were things that couldn't be said within a house, between four walls, and that if she truly wanted to understand, she should be willing to listen without interrupting. The walk there was made in silence. The city seemed numb, and the world around them remained indifferent to the intensity of the moment they were living. They sat on the same bench where it all began, the same one where Daniel had met his new wife weeks ago. He ran his fingers over the worn wood, as if touching an invisible memory, and then began to speak. He said that night he left the house where they lived, he had taken more than just clothes. He also took a sealed envelope that Laura had never seen. Inside were letters written throughout their marriage. Letters he had never had the courage to deliver. In each of them, there were confessions, doubts, silent pain, repressed desires. He spoke of the fear of losing her, of the nights when she went to bed early and he stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where they had lost each other. He spoke of the love he still felt even in the moments when he felt invisible. He spoke of the jealousy he wouldn't admit, of the small disappointments that had accumulated. But, above all, he spoke of his sincere desire to keep trying, to never give up. And that it was only on the last day, after the party, after seeing her dance with another man, that he finally understood there was no longer room for him there. Laura listened to it all with glazed eyes, but what devastated her came next. Daniel said that a week before the party, he had planned a surprise trip for them both. Nothing grand, just a weekend at a hidden inn, far from everything, where they had gone years ago, when they were still in love and unhurried. He wanted to reconnect, he wanted to open his heart, tell her he still loved her. He had already booked everything. He had even left the papers in an envelope in his desk drawer. But that night, seeing her laughing with another man, hearing the lightness in her voice when she referred to another man, he understood she was already gone. Not physically, but emotionally. So, when he got home, while she was sleeping, he went to the drawer, ripped open the envelope, and in its place wrote the letter she found later, the one saying he forgave her but that he couldn't go on any longer. Laura broke down. She cried without hiding it, without shame, without defense. She felt torn apart inside, as if everything she believed had been a momentary mistake had now become a sequence of decisions that led to the destruction of something pure. She tried to speak, to apologize again, to say she didn't know, that she would have done everything differently. But Daniel interrupted her. He said he wasn't there to reopen wounds. He was there because he felt she needed to know the truth. And because he needed to free himself from all of it, too. And then he told her what he hadn't told anyone yet. He said that the day he met his new wife, he had taken a box with him. A box he had kept since the beginning of their marriage. Inside it were all the notes Laura had written, photos of their first months together, movie tickets, travel tickets, napkins with silly messages. He never showed it to anyone. It was the reliquary of their love. And that day, seeing another woman with the same book in her hands, hearing her soft voice, feeling that he could still be looked at with interest, he decided to leave that box behind. And so he did. He buried the box right there, under the bench. Not out of anger. But because, in that moment, he understood that love that needs to be remembered with objects no longer lives in the present. And in that moment, as she cried uncontrollably beside him, he told her where the box was. He said that, if she wanted, she could dig it up. But he warned her, there would be nothing left there but memories of a time that would never return. She didn't answer. She stood there, silent, her face wet, her hands clasped together, staring at the ground as if the world had become too small to contain so much pain. Daniel stood, put his hands in his pockets, and began to walk away. She tried to call out to him, but her voice wouldn't come. She stood there, alone, listening to his footsteps disappearing into the trees, the sound of leaves crunching, and then, nothing. That night, he returned to the park. It was dark, but she knew exactly where the bench was. He picked up a small shovel and dug with trembling hands. He found the box. He opened it right there. And inside were all the memories. The clippings, the scribbles, the smiling photos of a love she'd let slip through her fingers. She cried there, alone, embracing everything she'd lost, and knew, with the cruel certainty of those who learn late, that some things never come back, no matter how much you wish them to. That there are losses that don't hurt at first, but tear you apart when you understand the value of what was destroyed. And there, kneeling on the same ground where her love was born and died, she finally understood the true weight of betrayal. And the most painful thing of all was knowing he'd found peace. Not just in another woman, but in yourself. Because Daniel didn't leave because of someone else. He left because one day he looked into her eyes and realized he was no longer seen. And no one lasts long being invisible where they most want to be noticed. In the days following the night in the park, Laura began to carry the weight of the box as a symbol of what she had lost and, even more painfully, of what she herself had allowed to be destroyed. She left the box in her living room, on the dining table that, for years, had witnessed dinners filled with stories, exchanged glances, and complicity. Now, that space was silent, and the objects in the box seemed to radiate a pain that could not be put into words. With each note read, each photo touched, she relived fragments of a life that, though still close, was already one step away from being forgotten by everyone but her. She didn't sleep well, ate little, and the days became a repetitive sequence of attempts to understand what she could have done differently. The hardest part was accepting that regret was no guarantee of forgiveness sufficient to undo what had been done. Because Daniel had already moved on, and worse than losing him was knowing that he was fine without her. He began to realize, with an almost cruel clarity, how life tends to give back exactly what you sow. He remembered the times he'd ignored his small gestures, the times he'd pretended not to notice he needed more than a simple, "I love you," said out of habit. He remembered the nights he'd chosen to look outward instead of inward, the coldly responded messages, the absences disguised as fatigue. Each memory was a needle that slowly pierced her, and even trying to distract herself, talk to friends, immerse herself in work, nothing was enough to silence the constant voice of regret. She even considered contacting Miguel, perhaps as a way to prove to herself it hadn't been in vain, but 2 seconds in front of his number were enough to realize she could never respect him. He'd been complicit in a weak moment, someone who should never have walked through the door she'd thrown open. And now, knowing that Daniel was offering another woman everything she had rejected on impulse hurt like a wound that bleeds unseen. Daniel, on the other hand, had found a new routine, a calm he hadn't remembered feeling in a long time. The relationship he was building with Sophia, a name Laura didn't yet know, and perhaps never would, was made of small truths, of comfortable silence, of respect. There was no rush, no need to prove anything. For the first time, he felt light in love, and this lightness didn't come from forgetting, but from understanding. He understood that everything he'd experienced with Laura had been real, profound, and remarkable, but he also knew he couldn't live forever in a story he alone was trying to sustain. The new relationship wasn't there to fill a void, but to show him that he was still capable of happiness and that he deserved someone who saw him whole. He was beginning to discover dormant versions of himself, and he felt a kind of silent gratitude for having had the courage to start over. Laura, meanwhile, began to live a routine marked by frustrated attempts at personal reconstruction. She signed up for pottery classes, tried to reconnect with her family, but something kept her from moving forward. It wasn't Daniel's absence per se, but the absence of who she was when she was with him. Because no matter how much she reinvented herself, she couldn't escape the shadow of who she had been in that relationship. She began to avoid certain places, not out of shame for others, but out of shame for herself. In the mirror, she saw a woman who had traded love for vanity, security for impulsiveness, and now lived haunted by her own reflection. She even wrote letters she never sent, drafted messages that were deleted before they were even read. She wanted to shout to the world that she regretted it, that she understood, that it was too late, but she also wanted to be forgotten. She carried a profound dilemma: try to regain the respect she had lost or learn to live with the guilt. One morning, she left early, aimlessly, and ended up back in the same park. She walked aimlessly among the trees, watching couples, families, children running. She sat on another bench, not theirs, because that one now seemed too sacred. There, she allowed herself to cry again, silently, while the world moved on. It was then that she felt something unexpected. A woman sat beside her, without saying a word. It was Sophia. Laura knew even before any words were spoken. There was something in her posture, in her gaze, in her serenity. They didn't look at each other for a few seconds, until Sophia, in a gentle tone, simply said, "I know who you are." Laura remained silent. She thought about getting up, about running away, but something stopped her. Sophia continued, her voice low but firm. She said she wasn't there to argue, that there was no anger in her heart, and that everything Daniel had experienced before her was part of who he was today. And that, however difficult it was, she respected that. Laura looked at her with teary eyes and, for the first time, felt real shame. Not the kind of shame that comes from being judged by others, but the kind that comes when confronted with the stark truth: she hadn't lost to a rival, but to someone who simply loved Daniel the way he deserved to be loved. She tried to apologize, but Sophia just smiled with a compassion that hurt. She said everyone makes mistakes, but the hardest part is dealing with the consequences. She stood up, lightly touched Laura on the shoulder, and said goodbye with a, "Take care of yourself." She walked away without looking back, leaving Laura there, devastated but strangely grateful. After that encounter, something began to change inside her. There was no longer room to blame time, routine, or Daniel. The guilt now had a name and a face. It was her. And although she couldn't change the past, she decided she wouldn't live forever as its prisoner. She began writing in a journal, every day, without censorship. She wrote about what she felt, what she lost, what she learned. She decided that, even if no one else read it, she needed to express what was tearing her apart. She began taking long walks, returned to reading the books she loved, and even found the courage to visit her mother's house, where she hadn't been in months. "I wasn't well, but I was trying." And this attempt, painful as it was already a path forward. Daniel never knew about the meeting between the two. Sophia never mentioned it, and Laura never brought it up either. Life went on. Slowly, but it went on. He planned a trip with Sophia, something simple, far from old memories, a well-deserved fresh start. She, in turn, began to take care of a small personal project. She created a book club for women who were starting over. She told stories, read old letters, and helped others rebuild themselves through literature and sharing. She never told her own story in its entirety, but used fragments of it to touch others without exposing herself too much. And it was there, among other women, that Laura began to understand that pain is not an end, but a process. And that, even though she would never have Daniel again, she could still do something valuable with what was left. She learned that regret only makes sense when it becomes action. And that, while forgiving others is important, the forgiveness you truly release is the one you give yourself. Still, on silent nights, he still cried. Because the longing for a true love, once lost, doesn't disappear. You just learn to sleep next to regret. But fate, as always, still had something unexpected in store. And when, months later, an envelope with no return address arrived at Laura's house, containing only a handwritten sentence, one she recognized immediately, she knew that chapter of her life hadn't yet completely closed. When Laura held the envelope in her hands, a chill ran down her spine. There was no sender, no sign of origin, just her name written in a handwriting that seemed painstakingly crafted, as if each letter carried the fragility of something yet unsaid. At first, she considered casting it aside, fearing it would be just another reminder of what she had lost. But curiosity, mixed with a quiet anguish, overcame her fear. She sat on the sofa, the same box she had buried in the park still beside her, and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single folded sheet, and on it, a simple sentence: "If you could go back in time, would you choose differently?" Reading it, she felt a tightness in her chest, as if the pain of everything she had been through had been summed up in a single question. She recognized the handwriting. It was Daniel's. Not because it was identical to the one in the letters he left, but because there was an emotional undertone there, a way of writing as if he were still looking inside her, even after everything. I didn't know when he had written it, or if it was recent or old, but knowing that the question had come from him stirred something that had already been pushed deep inside my chest. For days, she carried that question with her like a ghost. She tried to continue with her book club, her walks, her daily journal entries, but all it took was a pause, a moment of silence, for the phrase to echo in her mind again. She began to wonder if that letter meant he still thought of her, or if it was simply a form of closure, a kind of emotional testament left behind. She considered writing back, but had nowhere to send it. She considered ignoring it, but couldn't. The sentence unsettled her because, deep down, she knew the answer. And it destroyed her. She would have chosen differently. She would have acted with more care, more presence, more truth. But now, there was no going back. There was no way back. And even if he still thought of her in some way, that didn't mean there was room for a new beginning. It was then that she decided to do something she'd been avoiding for months: visit the place where they'd lived. The apartment had been sold, but she managed to contact the new residents and politely asked if she could visit just one last time, no strings attached, no disturbances. To her surprise, they accepted. Stepping onto the entryway, it was like being hit by a wave of memories, the good, the bad, the forgotten, all jumbled together in a collision of sensations difficult to bear. The smell of the wood, the layout of the rooms, even the light streaming through the windows, everything was familiar, but now carried the presence of other lives. She walked slowly, running her fingers along the walls, as if searching for something that had remained there, trapped in time. In the bedroom, she stopped before the window and let the tears fall unabated. Not because she wanted to go back, but because there she understood that the end of a love doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, as if each memory were a final goodbye. Leaving the building, she decided to walk to the cafe where she'd met Daniel. She went in, sat at the same table, and ordered the same coffee. There was no intention of recreating anything, just accepting. With each sip, he revisited a piece of his own history, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel pain. He also missed what was beautiful, what was sincere, what truly existed. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile, even though her eyes were still teary. And it was in this moment of silent introspection that a familiar figure crossed the threshold. It was Daniel's mother. The woman saw her, hesitated for a second, but approached with slow steps and a look of something Laura couldn't immediately decipher. They exchanged polite, cool greetings, and Daniel's mother asked if she could sit down. Laura nodded in surprise. What followed was one of the most difficult moments since the separation. His mother said she had heard about the encounter in the park, that she had also heard about the reunion with Sophia, and that, despite everything, there was something that needed to be said. He said that for a long time he had held a grudge against Laura, not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the silence that followed, the lack of genuine effort to win her back, the way she remained silent and accepted the loss as if there were nothing that could be done. But now, seeing that Laura still carried the pain, he felt that perhaps there was more than met the surface. He said that Daniel was changing, yes, that he was lighter, happier, but also more reserved. She said he didn't talk much about the past, but that, from time to time, he still maintained silences that came with Laura's name hidden behind his eyes. That shook her. It wasn't hope, it wasn't a desire for return, it was confusion. It was the knowledge that, even after everything, perhaps there were still remnants of a story that, though over, hadn't been completely overcome by either of them. She asked his mother if she thought Daniel still loved her. The answer was dry but true. She said that love changes form, that sometimes it becomes care, sometimes it becomes distance, sometimes it becomes just silence. And that what Daniel felt now might no longer be love, but respect. And that, in the end, was all that remained when love had served its purpose. Laura thanked him for his sincerity, and they said goodbye with a brief but meaningful hug. Leaving the cafe, she felt exhausted. As if everything she had been through was now a cycle almost closed, but still demanding one last gesture. A final farewell. Not to Daniel, but to herself. She decided to write one last letter. Not to send, but to read aloud in the park, where it all began and ended. The following week, she went there, alone. It was late afternoon. She carried only the envelope and a flower. She sat on the bench, waited for the sun to set, and then took the letter from her pocket. She read aloud, with a choked voice, words she had never dared to say in life. She asked for forgiveness for not seeing, for not being careful, for letting love slip away. He thanked her for the laughter, the silent nights, the mornings with coffee, the simple surprises, the books they shared. He said what they felt was true, and that even though it had been destroyed, he would never deny how beautiful it was while it lasted. When he finished, he left the flower on the bench and left. As she walked, she didn't feel light. She felt something deeper, acceptance. The awareness that certain wounds heal not to disappear, but to teach. The moral dilemma was now clear: live trapped in the past or honor what she had experienced by transforming it into a better version of herself. The choice was no longer about Daniel, nor about Sophia, nor about the mistake. It was about what she would do with what was left. And there, finally, she decided she wouldn't let guilt define who she was. She decided she would use all of this to become someone more attentive, more sensitive, more capable of appreciating love, if it ever crossed her path again. But what she didn't yet know was that Daniel, that very afternoon, had passed through the park. And, in the distance, he saw the woman he'd once loved reading a letter to the wind. He didn't hear the words. He just watched. He stood there for a few minutes, silent. And when she was gone, he walked to the bench, saw the flower, and understood. He gently picked it up, smiled wistfully, and left. Because some stories don't need to be rewritten. Just understood. And in that silent gesture, two souls said goodbye, each in their own time, each in their own way. But finally, in peace. The months turned into a new cycle of seasons, as if the passage of time itself had understood that this story needed to end with the same intensity with which it was built. Daniel now lived in another house, in a more remote neighborhood, surrounded by greenery, silence, and a peace he never knew how to name while in the midst of the hurricane that once was his life. It wasn't a peace made of the absence of pain, but of the presence of meaning. His relationship with Sophia evolved organically, unhurriedly, without pressure. He had finally found a space where he was heard without having to shout and loved without having to prove himself. Sophia saw him with calm but attentive eyes and respected the part of him that still bore scars. She never tried to replace them with promises, simply offering her presence as solace. Daniel, for his part, had stopped seeking answers to his old pains. He didn't ignore them, but neither did he let them determine his present. The story with Laura had become a memory buried with affection and pain at the same time. There was no more anger, just a memory that, every now and then, would emerge like a book read a long time ago, striking, but with no new pages. Laura, on the other hand, was on a completely different path. Her life was now divided between her commitments to her book club, the therapy sessions she began attending weekly, and the long periods of silence at home. There was no rush to rebuild. She still missed him, not as before, but in a more mature, less desperate way. It was a loss that didn't demand retribution, only acknowledgement. She had learned that love doesn't guarantee permanence and that one mistake can truly cost everything. Little by little, she rebuilt her relationship with her mother, resumed writing chronicles, and began giving short lectures at events about literature and emotion. She spoke with authority about new beginnings, but avoided mentioning names. She guarded the story as if it were a shared secret between her and her scars. Sometimes, she saw news of Daniel on social media from mutual friends, saw smiling photos, discreet trips, light moments. Her heart ached, but it no longer bled. Until, at a book launch event for one of the women who frequented the club, their paths crossed for the last time. It was unexpected, uninvited, unplanned. He showed up with Sophia, who was now also writing. The room was full, and when their eyes met, there was a moment frozen in time. They both smiled respectfully, and she gave a slight nod, to which he responded with the same restrained gesture. There was no conversation, no closeness. Only the understanding that that moment, brief and silent, was all that still needed to be said. Laura left shortly after, without saying goodbye. She walked to her car with her head held high, but with a knot in her chest. She cried when she got home, but it was a different kind of cry. It was one of closure. Of recognition. The cry of someone who finally understood that the past doesn't need to be erased to move forward, but rather accepted with all its pain and beauty. Days later, Laura received a small box delivered by a motorcycle courier. There was no return address, but inside was only one book. It was Sophia's first book, recently published. The dedication, delicately written on the first page, contained only one sentence: "May your story find peace, as ours found light." Laura smiled through her tears. She didn't know if the gift was a kindness from Daniel, Sophia, or both. But she understood the message. Life had moved on, for everyone, and now, there was nothing left to prove. She took the book, placed it next to the box where she kept her old memories, and took a deep breath. It was time to live in the present. The following month, Laura decided to do something she'd never done before: a solo trip. She chose a small place, surrounded by mountains and a lot of silence. She wanted to reconnect with herself without her previous references, far from everything that reminded her of what had been. There, she wrote what would become her first book, not about betrayal, nor about lost love, but about forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness you ask for or offer, but the kind you find when you learn to carry your own story without destroying yourself. When she published the book months later, she received messages from women all over the country. Women who had also made mistakes, who had also lost, who were also trying to rebuild themselves. For the first time, she felt that something of all this had been worthwhile. Not because it justified the mistakes, but because it gave them meaning. Daniel, for his part, was already making wedding plans with Sophia. A simple, intimate event, just for the closest ones. "I didn't want to repeat anything from the past, just celebrate the present." Before the wedding, she returned to the park where she'd buried the box. The bench was still there, but the tree beside it was now larger, as if time had decided to accompany this new beginning. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He simply sat there for a few minutes, silently, remembering. When he got up, he left an envelope with a letter he'd written to Laura but never delivered. He hadn't expected her to find it. It was just a gesture. A way of telling himself he was ready to live another story, with love, with truth, and, above all, with presence. And so, the two moved on. There were no romantic reunions, no forced twists and turns. Each found their own path, in different but equally important directions. Because a happy ending isn't always being together. Sometimes, a happy ending is learning to walk without carrying the weight of who you were when you didn't yet know what true love was. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part moved you the most? Have you ever experienced something similar? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, activate the bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It erodes trust, ruins plans, erases happy memories, and drags hearts to places from which it's hard to return. Nothing is worth more than true love. And when it's disrespected, what's lost isn't just the other person, it's also the best part of who you were with them. May this story serve as a warning, but also as a mirror. Because when trust is broken, what remains is not just pain. It's the chance, painful, but real, to rebuild. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell fictional stories with the purpose of showing how devastating it can be to choose to hurt someone who only wanted to be loved with respect. Until next time.